This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. In my last show, I had a number of women born in the month of May. And in fact, we ended up, I believe, on May 27th with several women. Amelia Bloomer, the woman who tried to correct women's fashions so that women didn't have to drag around pounds and pounds and pounds of heavy skirts and underskirts and so on, but didn't really succeed on May 27th. But that was also the birth date of the well-known, wonderful environmentalist of our own times, Rachel Carson, and also of the famous Julia Ward Howe, the American author. She was a proponent of Mother's Day for Peace, actually, and she promoted it for many years. But when Mother's Day was finally adopted by the U.S., it became more a time for candy and flowers for Mom rather than a Mother's Day of Peace, which Julia Ward Howe had promoted for so long. May 28th is the birthday of, that's the death date, actually, of Anne Bronte, one of the talented Bronte sisters, the youngest of the girls. Charlotte, of course, the one who survived the longest and actually was a famous authoress in her day. And Emily, who wrote Wuthering Heights and died almost immediately thereafter. And then Anne Bronte, the youngest of the girls, who wrote a book called The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which supposedly drew upon the dissolute life of her brother, who, drank himself to death, basically, it seems. Then the 29th is the birth date in 1830 of Louise Michel. She was a famous radical in France in the 19th century, a woman who took over, actually. She actually took over in 1871 when the Paris Commune was on. And after the Paris Commune failed and the conservatives came back to power, they sent her locked in a cage on a 4-month journey with an anarchist woman, and the anarchist woman converted Louise Michel to anarchism. However, one good thing about Louise Michel's anarchism, anarchism means being against having government. The anarchists said no government. There should be no government because government was really an oppressor. But Louise Michel was not a violent anarchist, as some were known, who actually assassinated people. She was one of the peaceful anarchists who did not embrace terrorism. On May 30th, probably the most famous teenager in all of world history, Joan of Arc. Sometimes, if you take her French pronunciation, it's Jeanne d'Arc. Jeanne d'Arc. She was from Domremy in northeast France. And actually, when my husband and I were in Germany in the 1950s, we visited in Domremy, the hometown of the famous Joan of Arc, who was burned at the stake by the British because she was the woman who was leading the French armies as a teenager. And she was burned at the stake, and that's how come we know that May 30th was her death day. She was killed in Rouen, France, after being captured by the British. And they thought she was a witch, of course, but she wound up as a Catholic saint. In 1920, Joan of Arc was named as a Catholic saint. Then on May 31st, we have Elizabeth Blackwell, who was probably the first woman doctor in America who had actually attended medical school. She attended medical school at Geneva College, and the story is told. Of course, all the students there were men, basically, and she applied, and as a joke, the men unanimously agreed to accept her as a student. Well, they thought they were just joking, but she actually showed up and became a very good student, sort of one of the top in her class at Geneva College in New York, the medical school. So that became her claim to fame, Elizabeth Blackwell, and she spent her life well. She said it was really rather important that there be some women doctors, because for one thing, it was, women have to be examined by doctors, and it would be easier probably for most women to be examined by a woman doctor rather than a male doctor. Well, that was the month of May. Now we turn to June, and the first person in June was actually hanged to death because she was a Puritan heretic who refused to stop preaching. The men said, no preaching by women. They exiled her from Boston and so on. But she came back and she kept preaching, and eventually they had to hang her after, and on the first occasion when they took her to the hanging post, she went with two male friends who were supporting her. And all three were prepared for execution. They hanged the two men, and they did not hang Mary Dyer at the time. However, she came right back to Boston and started talking again. So they finally up and hanged her. And that was Mary Dyer, who died in 1660 on June 1st in Boston, Massachusetts. June 2nd is the birthday of Mary Read. Now, I think maybe we do have a picture of Mary Read. No. She was raised as a boy by her mother, who was trying to convince a well-to-do relative to make her child his heir. And so she was used to being accepted as a male, and she wound up as a sailor, actually. Now, this was in the 1790s, in the 17th century. The 1690s was about her birth date. I guess they've actually sort of assigned her to the second day of June. But she became a sailor as a male. No one knew she was really a woman. And her ship was taken over by pirates in the Gulf of Mexico, I believe. And she joined the pirates. So Mary Read became a pirate. And in fact, she was captured in 1720. And they discovered she was a woman when she gave birth to a child, a baby, you know. And well, that saved her from execution at one time. But as it happened to too many women in the old days, she actually died in childbirth. And that was the end of Mary Read, the famous woman who became a sailor and a pirate. Our next person for June 3rd is Josephine Baker. And she was born in St. Louis in 1906. She became a famous singer and dancer, and particularly in France. She made her career basically in France. She was a black woman, and she became a French citizen, actually, eventually, and was in France even during World War II. She stayed in France, and although she was most famous for the 1920s and 30s, she continued living in France during the Second World War and finally passed away there. June 4th is the death date at age 70 of Dorothy Gish. We have a picture here which I think shows Dorothy Gish and her more famous sister, Lillian Gish. Both were actresses in the teens and 20s of the last century. And Dorothy was the one who had the June 4th birthday, but she's probably the girl that you see with the lighter colored hair, and with her more famous sister, Lillian Gish. Both well-known actresses, but especially Lillian had to kind of help Dorothy along to get parts, which she was not sad to do. But Dorothy Gish died at age 70 in Italy, and that was in 1968, many years after she had been a famous actress. June 5th is the birth date of Marion Fallon Leslie, and this shows that she was born in 1836. It certainly shows her in a 19th century costume with a wasp waist and really cinched in with corsets, the way that women were in the 19th century. She was born in New Orleans on June 5th in 1836. And this book says, how on earth is it that they have never made a story of her life? Miriam Leslie. Not only was she born in New Orleans, but she grew up and became a dancer with the famous Lola Montez. And she married a very wealthy man named Ephraim Squire. And through him, she became a part of high society in the 19th century. His name was Frank Leslie, so that's why she's known as Miriam Leslie. And for something like 10 years, there was a ménage à trois, as they call it, 3 people living together, namely Miriam Leslie and her husband, whose name was Squires. And Leslie lived with them, and eventually they got divorces, and Miriam married Leslie, Frank Leslie. It says they made a fortune during the Civil War, and Miriam became the editor of a women's magazine during that time. Frank Leslie was an important publisher in the 19th century, and so he gave her a good job there. Well, she became a very wealthy woman, and when she died in 1914, she had $2 million to give away. Guess who she gave it to? Bet you never guess. She was a well-known suffragette, Miriam Leslie, and she left the money, $2 million, to Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the probably best known of the women who promoted women's suffrage in the early days of the last century. She left $2 million to Carrie Chapman Catt to further the cause of women's suffrage. Hurrah for Miriam Leslie. June 6th is the birthday of a woman called Meta Fox Warwick Fuller. Now, Ms. Fuller was a black woman who became a famous sculptress. She was born in 1877, and so most of her famous sculptures and so on were made during the early part of the last century. She even made a sculpture showing a slave who had been liberated for W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous black philosopher. So Miss Fuller had a long life as a sculptor, born in 1877 on June 6th in Philadelphia. Now on June 7th, we have Virginia Apgar. Virginia Apgar was born in New Jersey in 1909, and you may not have heard of her, but she invented a quick test given to newborn babies. Now, the test, of course, did not ask the babies to do anything. What it was an analysis of how the baby looked and acted in its very first moments of life. And that was called the Apgar score, and was used to take a look at newborns and has been used, I still believe it is used, to take a look at newborns and sort of assess right away whether you can tell whether there's some problem that they might have. So she was famous for that. And then in 1959, she became a fundraiser for the March of Dimes. The March of Dimes, you know, is celebrated particularly, I remember from my childhood. January 30th was the birthday of our president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, of course, was crippled with polio when he was a grown man in the 1920s, and he never actually walked again. He was able to get along with crutches or leaning on one of his sons, something like that, but that was about the long and the short of it as far as APGAR was concerned. Now, June 8th is the birthday in 1903 in Belgium of Marguerite Yourcenar. She wrote in French. She was from the French-speaking part of Belgium, and she did come to the United States, then became an American citizen, but she continued to write in French exclusively, even after she was living in Bar Harbor near Mount Desert in Maine. She continued her writing in French, but of course her novels were translated into English, so that she's well known for being a novelist. She was the first woman of a literary background to be admitted to the Académie Française, which for several hundred years had nobody but male members for the French Academy. But she was the first woman of a literary background to be admitted to the French Academy, Marguerite Yourcenar, American citizen by the time she died. Now, June 9th was the birthday of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, born in 1836. And she was this is a picture, as you can see, is of a British stamp. She was the first real doctor in terms of having studied, who was a woman, who was British. So this is why she is honored on a British stamp, and for the things that she did for women's health. She was not allowed to become a member of the medical societies that they had in those days, because they were all for women. But she discovered that the apothecaries, that is to say, of course, the druggists, the druggists didn't have a sex requirement, that a person had to be male in order to become an apothecary. And when she discovered this, she applied to become an apothecary, and sure enough, they had to make her an apothecary because there was no sex requirement. However, after she became an apothecary, they immediately changed the rules so that no more women in the 19th century in Britain could become licensed apothecaries or druggists. But she did actually, since she was, medicine was really her field, not drugs per se, she did specialize in women's health. And she was recognized as a doctor in France, which wasn't as snooty as the English in terms of whether women could be doctors in the 19th century. Now, June 10th is the birthday of Judy Garland. Judy Garland, the famous American actress. Here's a nice picture of her as a young woman. And of course, probably her most famous role was as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, that she did when she was a teenager, and they had to sort of, bind her up so she looked like she was still a little girl, although she was about as tall as all the other actors who played with her in Wizard of Oz, you know, the Scarecrow. And I think the Tin Woodman was a very tall man, but some of those characters, even the Cowardly Lion, weren't terribly tall. And Judy Garland was a pretty strapping teenager by the time she became Dorothy of Oz. She had harder times in her later years. She had 4 marriages, and she died of a drug overdose eventually. But she's remembered forever for the wonderful role she played as a girl in the Andy Hardy series and in The Wizard of Oz. She did play a grown-up lady in 1954 in A Star is Born, and she had a marvelous concert at Carnegie Hall that sold the first 1 million copies album of a double album, it's called, of the Carnegie Hall performance that Judy Garland performed in 1961, I guess that was, yeah. 1961 was Judy Garland at Carnegie Hall. On June 11th, Julia Margaret Cameron was born. She was born in India because her father was in the British civil service in India when she was born in 1815. She was a 19th century woman. She became a very well-known photographer. This is not a self-portrait that she did. This was a picture of her, a photograph of her by a well-known male photographer. But she photographed some pretty famous people in her day, Julia Cameron. Among the people she photographed were Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and he was a poet, of course, an American poet. Alfred Lord Tennyson, the British famous poet. Robert Browning, another British poet. Thomas Carlyle, who was a famous English author of the 19th century. Ellen Terry, who was a well-known actress of that day, and Alice Liddell. Now, you probably haven't heard her name, but Alice Liddell was the model for a famous book, and the book was Alice in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll, that was his. He was actually a well-known mathematician, but he used the pen name Lewis Carroll to write Alice in Wonderland, and was modeled on Alice Liddell, a neighbor of Lewis Carroll. Now, on June 12th, here's another British woman, Harriet Martineau. Harriet Martineau was a well-known author in the 19th century. She was British, but she came to the United States. She came about the same time as a famous Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville spent a couple of years here in the United States. Then he went back to France and wrote a book, famous book called Democracy in America, which is still considered sort of an astonishing way of seeing what Americans were like, and not only in the 19th century in the 1830s, but to some extent how Americans still are. Well, Harriet Martineau came to the United States about that same time. She spent 2 years in the United States. She traveled all over. She was even taken up to the famous outlook over the valleys in West Virginia. She was taken up by a famous American man to see that outlook. And when she went back to England, she wrote a book called Society in America. And some people credit her with being the first professional sociologist because of the book that she wrote called Society in America, that was published about 1840 and was an account of the things that she saw in the United States when she was here in the 1830s. Harriet Martineau. Now, June 13th is the birthday in 1752 of Fanny Burney. Fanny Burney. She was an actress, but she was better known as an author, and you see her here with one of those giant hats that women wore in the 18th century in America and in England. Fanny Burney was born in 1752 in England, and she was writing at a time when novels were considered kind of scandalous. So the very first novel she started writing, she decided she better not keep up with it because novelists were considered, not quite proper people. And she burned her first novel, but she couldn't stop writing. So she went on, and she did write several more books that were well known. And she invented a kind of novel called the novel of manners. You know, what do people do and say in society? Probably the best known author of novels of manners is Jane Austen, who was a younger contemporary of Fanny Burney. Jane Austen was born in the 1770s, whereas Fanny Burney was born in the 1750s. But she survived, and she survived socially as well. Some people thought, well, it was so scandalous to be a novelist that no one would want to marry such a woman, such a scandalous woman. But she had quite a happy marriage after all. So good for Fanny Burney. On June 14th, we have the birthday of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the American authoress, who is quite well known in her day. In fact, she wrote the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 1850s when she was living in Ohio, in Cincinnati. Or I guess she maybe wrote it and then immediately moved back to Connecticut where she was born, but she had been raised in Cincinnati by her parents. And it was the fact that she had been in Cincinnati right across the river from slaveholding Kentucky that gave her the background information for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was credited in part for bringing on the American Civil War, you know, because it gave such a sad story of the horrors of American slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe went on to write a lot of other things, but she's best known for Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that was a fantastically popular book at a time when a popular novel was considered a success if it sold as many as 10,000 copies. She sold 300,000 copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the first year and a half after its publication in 1852. So she certainly established her time, and she became a very wealthy woman, especially for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, but she didn't stop there. She went on and wrote a number of other important things. She, well, let's see, I think I should also mention that June 14th was the funeral in 1913 of a woman called Emily Davison. Emily Davison was not well known, the name is not well known, but she was a fierce believer in women's suffrage. And in 1913, she ran into the Derby race, or the Derby, as it's called in England, the Derby race, and was killed as a martyr. She became a martyr for women's suffrage. So June 14th, 1913 was the funeral day of Emily Davison, the Derby martyr. Now in June 15th is the death date of a woman called Vera Nikolaevna Figner, and she died at age 90 in 1942. This shows her as a very young woman, but she studied medicine in Switzerland. She was a Russian, and she died in Moscow in 1942. But she was I guess she she was one of the anarchists who was in favor of terror, actually, because she played a role in the group that was credited or blamed for the assassination of the Russian Tsar in 1881. And she was actually arrested and condemned to death for being involved with that plot to assassinate the Tsar of Russia in 1883. But she was not actually hanged. She spent 20 years in solitary confinement because of her being involved with the Tsar's assassination. And she wrote poetry in her time of being confined for 20 years, and an autobiography called How the Clock of Life Stopped. In 1904, she was released from prison, but sent to Siberia, which of course was the other way in which Russian prisoners or former prisoners were punished, was by sending them to Siberia, which is a very cold and unpleasant place, they say, most of the time. And she lived long enough that the Russian Revolution occurred, and she became a heroine because the Bolsheviks took over in Russia, and they said, my goodness, we're going to have to rehabilitate Vera Figner because she really was one of the first Russian revolutionaries. And so she died at age 90 in 1942 as a heroine of the Soviet Union, Vera Figner. Now, on June 16th, Sarah Ellis was, she died in London in 1872. Now, during the 19th century, Sarah Ellis, and we think this is a picture of her that we found, she wrote a number of books of etiquette. The women of England, the daughters of England, the wives of England, the mothers of England. She wrote books about what women should do, what their roles were if they wanted to be considered keepers of etiquette. Sarah Ellis, the famous writer in England of books of etiquette during the 19th century, dying in 1872 on June 16th. Now, the 17th of June is associated in our book, Remember the Ladies, with Artemisia of Halicarnassus. However, they don't know anything about exactly when and where she was born. Well, she was certainly associated with the kingdom of Halicarnassus, and she became the queen of that kingdom upon the death of her father, since she was his only heir. And this was long, long ago in the 6th century BC. Artemisia of Halicarnassus. She's been assigned to June 17th. I guess they couldn't find a more famous woman, so they decided to put someone who was born so long ago no one really knew when she was actually born. But this shows her in her most famous role as Queen of Halicarnassus. She was an ally of the Persian dictator Xerxes, and she fought the Athenian navy in the Battle of Salamis. Well, the Athenians won, and in fact it's said that Xerxes, watching the battle and seeing that his men were getting the worst of it, but that Artemisia of Halicarnassus seemed to be doing the best job of the fighting, even though they were losing the battle, said something like, "Oh, my women are like men and my men are like women." So Artemisia of Halicarnassus is well known for being on Xerxes' side during the Battle of Salamis in the 6th century BC. Well, for June 18th, we have Deuna Barnes. Deuna Barnes died on June 18th in 1982. So she must have been born in 1892. And we think this is a picture of Deuna Barnes. She was a novelist, and she was known as probably one of the first well-known lesbian authors. She wrote a 1928 novel called Ryder, R-Y-D-E-R, about lesbianism, and another book called Nightwood, which apparently is also celebrates lesbianism. June 19th is the death date of Ethel Rosenberg. We're going to have a picture here of Ethel Rosenberg and her husband, actually. You notice the grill there. this is a picture of them when they were in prison before their execution as spies. They were executed as spies in 1953. Was said that they had smuggled to the Russians, to the Soviets, that they had smuggled plans for atomic energy and atomic bombs to the Russians. So Ethel Rosenberg was executed after her husband, but she was executed at age 37 in 1953 on the date June 19th, 1953. So it was a case. Now she always maintained that they had not, well, what she had actually done was to write something, you know, she had typed up what her husband wrote, and he was maybe the actual spy, but she told her boys, her sons, that they were not spies and that they had been wrongly executed. But in any case, they certainly were executed as spies. It was a famous case of the early 1950s when Ethel Rosenberg was executed in 1953 on June 19th. Now, June 20th is the birth anniversary of Lillian Hellman. Lillian Hellman is a famous American author, a woman. She first came to fame probably in 1934 with a play called The Children's Hour. And it was an interesting story about women who were accused of being lesbians. Now, it was not clear apparently in the play whether they really were, but they certainly were accused of lesbianism, and it meant that they were lost their jobs as teachers. So Lillian Hellman wrote that play, The Children's Hour, in 1934, and probably it's her best-known work. But she also worked in Hollywood. Actually, her longtime lover, partner, was the author Dashiell Hammett, who wrote many detective stories in the 1930s and so on. She was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, Lillian Hellman, and asked to name names of other communists. Well, she said she'd tell them anything about herself, but she would absolutely not say anything about anybody else. And she hung on to that, and she talked for about an hour, and they just gave up on her. The House Un-American Activities Committee just let her go after she talked for about an hour, a little over an hour, and actually she was the first person who sort of stood up to the House Un-American Activities Committee, who was doing a lot of investigating of communists and so-called communists and communist sympathizers and so forth back in the late 1940s and early 50s. And she was the first person who really stood up to the House Un-American Activities Committee and was one of the factors in the eventual downfall, in spite of Senator Joseph McCarthy coming to prominence at that time. On June 21st, we have the birthday of Judy Holliday. Judy Holliday was a comedian, beautiful woman, and a very smart person, but she made her living as an actress playing dumb blondes. not only dumb blondes, but kind of nutty blondes, ditzy blondes, and so on. That was her. Born Yesterday was, I remember seeing that play and that movie in the early days. She was born in 1921 on June 21st, and like I say, was well known during the 1940s. Judy Holliday, a comedian. The next birth date that we have, which again, here is someone who lived so long ago, they don't really know when she was born, except that she was born in the year 1584, in all likelihood. In other words, she was born at a time when England was a very different place, shall we say. But she became famous as a bandit. She was known as Moll Cutpurse, and this apparently is an artist's rendition sometime along the line in the 16th century of Mary Frith, known as Moll Cutpurse, the bandit, and she was really a rough bandit. She didn't play any favorites with the people she robbed. She robbed them for good, and she was the head of a successful gang of bandits, as a matter of fact, for quite a while. So Mary Frith, better known as Moll Cutpurse, and she's been assigned June 22nd as a birth date. June 23rd is the birthday of Wilma Rudolph. Wilma Rudolph, the famous American athlete. And the picture that we have of her shows her with some of her gold medals that she won in 1960 in the Olympics. Wilma Rudolph, a black woman who, as a child, had been crippled up, and people didn't think that she would ever walk at one point again because of this crippling disease she had. But she survived that, and she became a famous runner, also basketball player. And it was for those that she won 3 gold medals as a runner and as a basketball player in the 1960 Olympics. Wilma Rudolph, born June 23rd, 1940. Our next woman is Sarah Orne Jewett. Her is a death date, actually. She died at age 59 in Maine in the year 1909. And she is probably best known for a book she wrote about Maine called The Country of the Pointed Firs. Now, this is not as well known today as it was when she first wrote it, but it's interesting that according to the American author Willa Cather, Cather thinks that there are the three greatest American novels are Huck Finn by Mark Twain, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and The Country of Pointed Firs by Sarah Orne Jewett. So she certainly won the approval of another well-known woman author, Willa Cather. June 25th is a death date also That's the death date at age 76 in Texas in 1951 of Ma Ferguson. Ma was a nickname, and this shows her as governor of Texas, which she was elected to on 2 separate occasions, partly because her husband had been denied approval to run again for governor. He had served as governor, but there were problems, and so she ran instead, and she was elected twice as governor of Texas. The 26th of June is Pearl Buck, our neighbor from Hillsboro, West Virginia, born in 1892 and famous especially for her novels about China, like The Good Earth. She's the only American woman who has ever been given a Nobel Prize in literature for the books that she wrote. She spoke here in Athens, and her plaque is at Memod, if you want to go and see Pearl Buck's plaque. Well, the 27th of June is Helen Keller. There's her. And the 28th is Mary Astell, born in the 17th century. And she promoted women's education. The 29th is Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the famous woman poet from England who ran off, and she died at age 55 on June 29th, 1861. She was a famous poet. And finally, Eden Southworth. There's a name for you. She died in 1899, and she was a famous author in the 19th century. It's said she wrote 60 Gothic novels. That's more than one a year for 30 years, 2 a year for 30 years or something like that. Eden Southworth died at 79 in 1899. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. And I'm wearing my t-shirt because June 20th is my birthday, and I turned 86 on June 20th, and this is my birth shirt that shows Route 50 across Nevada, where I grew up.